These women were reported on in local newspapers as they were performing official functions. And this is sort of what my argument is ultimately going to be about, the official meaning of beauty queens. It's easy to think of a beauty queen somehow as like a parody of royalty, but I'm going to argue that in a rigorous sense, beauty queens perform state functions and that they're not so much imitations of, say, the queen of a country, but rather they are literal queens of micro principalities and nano fiefdoms. With two exceptions, all of the newspapers I'm looking at are Caribbean and especially Cuban emigre newspapers from Florida or New York. And they're all from the years 1954 to 1963. I realize I'm outside of the time period of the conference, so sorry. And I'm especially interested in how they intersect with political events in Cuba, especially around the revolution. I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining what this phenomenon of beauty queens is and who these women are. Like I said, in the mid-century, they're really extremely common. And then I'm going to look at three cases of beauty queens who are sent on goodwill missions from the continental United States to the Caribbean in the 1950s and 60s with varying political outcomes. Okay, so who are they? Who do they rule over? The beauty queens I'm going to be talking about almost all have some kind of organizational affiliation or they're affiliated with an event. So they might be sponsored by a radio program. In New York, it's really common for local newspapers to sponsor them, social clubs, parades, balls. This is actually one of two images I have that's from a Mexican-American newspaper. This one's in Texas. But I like this one because I think it illustrates the organizational thing nicely because this woman, Ana Maria Gonzalez, is wearing a sash that says Mexican Chamber of Commerce, right? So Miss Ana Maria Gonzalez represents the Mexican Chamber of Commerce in Texas as its queen. These women also travel a lot in their capacity as queens. It's weird. I wanted to figure out what that's about and why they keep getting sent to all of these places. So just a couple examples. In New York, the Miss Estrella del Norte contest in its advertisement emphasizes its prize, which is a trip to Puerto Rico. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, there's the annual excursion of La Fiesta Latina, which is from Tampa, led by a man named Leon Casin. This year, the queen, this is in 1959, the queen is Silvia Jimenez, and they go to New York, they go to Mexico City this year, so pretty nice trip. But the thing that really trips me out about this one is that it's published on January 2nd, 1959. So like as the revolution is triumphing, right? This is an item that's like sandwiched between just, like cover to cover stories about the Cuban Revolution. And then there's this item about the delegation of beauty queens going to Mexico City. And then just one more piece about the travel. This one's also pretty wild. This is Fiesta Latina again, this time from 1963. And the queen this year is Carol Ann Mendez, still led by Leon Casin. And this sounds like a pretty extravagant trip. So first they go to San Juan, Puerto Rico, then they go to Lisbon, Madrid, Rome, Paris. But the crazy thing about this one to me is that, so this is in La Gaceta, and the article says that if you cough up a little over $1,000, you can go with them. So I looked at an inflation calculator, and $1,000 in 1963 is worth about $8,000 today. It's all expenses paid. So I guess the proposition is you pay to travel with these young women. Kind of creepy, but I'm really curious to know if anyone took them up on this. Anyway. So this is just scratching the surface of the traveling. So they do lots and lots of traveling, and everywhere these women go, they're always the object of gossip, or really probably I mean something more like idle chatter, because it's usually represented as something positive. So on the right-hand side, there's a caption to a photo of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York, and it says, "As the majestic float passes by, you could hear words of admiration." Then on the right-hand side, is another contingent of beauty queens from Tampa that I'm going to be talking about that visits Cuba. And as they're walking around on the street, everywhere you could hear commentaries such as, "Esas son las reinas de Tampa." Those are the queens of Tampa. And Que mujeres tan lindas hay en Tampa. So what beautiful women they have in Tampa. So, they're constantly being watched, kind of evaluated and talked about. So, the place I'm going with this, it's maybe a little bit obvious, but I want to do something that's hopefully kind of specific with it. Namely, the category of the beauty queen is, of course, constituted by the male gaze. So unlike in Sita and Kelly's presentations, these are publications that are like, I don't know that women have anything to do with this reporting, right? It's like women being reported on by men. So I've been going back and reading Laura Mulvey, the feminist film theorist who was the first to theorize the male gaze. And a few things strike me about what Mulvey says. And, of course, there's a lot of really important things to be said about the way that women's bodies are represented in these images. But the part of Mulvey's theory that I really want to talk about is that, according to Mulvey, women appear to the male gaze in a spectacle that interrupts narrative. So Mulvey is thinking about movies when she says this, but I also see this with beauty queens in a number of ways. For instance, I see this with the placement of their stories within the newspaper, with the way that the items about them are sandwiched between items about historical events. So this is the other image that I have that's from a Mexican-American newspaper. This time it's from the Latin Times in East Chicago, Indiana. And I like this one for its graphic layout. I think it illustrates what I'm talking about kind of nicely. So there's a piece here about a contestant. Her name is kind of a tongue twister to say, Juanita Guanajuato, who's running for the queen of the Fiestas Patrias in East Chicago. And the item says where she went to school, where she's had a job, who her parents are. And it's imbricated here in this layout with a radically different kind of news item, an interview with a Cuban rebel. So this is from, the summer of 1958. This is front page, by the way. And so the stories about these queens are just so markedly different from the items that they're next to, and that they're written in such a formulaic way. You just need to plug in a few details into a template and you're done, right? Who are your parents? Have you ever had a job, etc. And just to judge by, the reporting on the coronations and the ceremonies where the beauty queens appear, like it seems like nothing ever happens, if you were just to go by what they report. The pieces they're always like, we had such a nice time. The queen looked lovely. We were also glad to see each other. It's the kind of thing that if you wanted to, you could write the piece before you actually went to the event. And the only thing that might surprise you is say, like if you find out who's getting the crown. So I want to posit that there are two orders of news items in these papers that are analogous to what Mulvey talks about when she says that in film, under the male gaze, female spectacle interrupts a paradigmatically male narrative. So in these newspapers, there's the historical narrative, the grand narrative of history, the rebels gathering in the Sierra Maestra, marching westward, Batista flees, etc. And then there are the items featuring the beauty queens. And I'm going to call these items non-events. And so I use the word event in the sense of, something that's incalculable, indecipherable, unpredictable, and an eruption of and into the prescribed order. So in that understanding, a revolution would be the event par excellence, right? It's the thing that kind of changes up the syntax that we use to make stories legible and to understand what's going on. And beauty queens, as they're represented in these papers, are precisely, the counterpiece to that kind of eruption. They constitute the very order that the political event disrupts. So I want to argue that we can map the logic of the state function onto the beauty queen, who is precisely meant to subtend grand political narrative and ensure a fundamental backdrop of continuity against which governments can change. So the queen is the state, the prime minister is the government. The queen can change, or sorry, the government can change, the prime minister can change, but the world of the queen operates according to a different rhythm and with a different logic, and is there to administer decorum, ensure stability. So we'll look at one example of what that looks like when it works according to the model, and then a couple examples of what it looks like when it doesn't. So the first case I'm going to look at is from the period of the Battistato, specifically from September 1956. And the Tampa newspaper, Traducción Prensa, reports on a delegation sent to Cuba from Tampa that meets with Batista. And Miss Círculo Cubano is present there, and she presents Batista with an album as a gift. And this is written, like, this article is written very strangely. There's something a little bit off about it. Like, it's written in a very flowery way. It goes on forever for pages and pages, and yet it doesn't include very many specifics. You know, it hardly names anyone in the delegation from Tampa. It doesn't include any dates. And you'd think they also have wanted to include pictures from their visit, but in fact, they just include pages and pages of press photos of Fulgencio Batista's wife, Marta Fernandez. So these are not pictures of the delegation. These are just like pictures of Marta Fernandez, you know, at various ribbon cutting ceremonies and, you know, giving speeches. The image quality here is of course poor, but you can kind of tell that on the right, she's cutting a ribbon. But of course, the reality is that the situation under Batista's rule is, you know, pretty, you know, on and off, pretty tense and unstable. And La Gaceta is certainly reporting on this in 1956. But then, so this placid visit by this delegation, including Miss Círculo Cubano and cohort, serves exactly the stabilizing, leveling function that someone like Batista would want, right? You know, what rebels? I'm having tea with a beauty queen. The second case I'm going to talk about is pretty wild. So I'm drawing this from a newsletter called Ecos that's published in Tampa by Key West-born Cuban Tampeño named Rubén Favelo, who Favelo had the only Spanish language radio program in Tampa in the 40s and most of the 50s called Fiesta en Tampa. And from 1954 to 1959, he also led annual goodwill missions to Cuba associated with his radio show. And these missions consisted pretty heavily of beauty queens. So in 1959, this included the Anglo Miss Tampa, and it also included the Miss Círculo Cubano of that year, Hilda Munoz. So obviously lots of shots of them in their bathing suits. This publication, Ecos, was a one-off published on the occasion of the group's only trip to Cuba after the revolution. And the publication was basically, you know, you could think of it as a newsletter about the trip. It includes some material that makes the group look kind of like bumbling tourists, including an item about how their luggage got lost and another about how they all needed Pepto-Bismol. So why did Favelo only publish this for the 1950 trip and not for any of the earlier trips? As far as I can tell, it's because his main motivation here was to settle a score with someone who he felt had made unjust accusations against him, namely one Juan Perez, who belonged to the Tampa chapter of the July 26th movement. Perez apparently conducted a campaign accusing Fiesta en Tampa, as well as the Círculo Cubano and the Unión Martí Maceo, of having once been pro-Batista. The whole story is documented in this newsletter. It's organized in a little bit of a haphazard way, but from what I can reconstruct, Perez seems to have communicated his accusations to Carlos Franqui, the editor of the Cuban newspaper Revolución, and generally an important figure in the revolution. And Franqui published something attacking Favelo. You can't really see it here, but you can't really make it out here, but this is the first page of a long letter Favelo wrote to Franqui disputing the charges. Friends of Favelo's also wrote a letter denouncing Franqui to the commissioner of Camagüey, where Fiesta en Tampa was slated to visit. Favelo, I think, kind of pettily reproduces all the names of the people who signed that letter here. Favelo and company also received a sort of scrawled, menacing postcard that he reproduces in this newsletter. But then Favelo refutes the charges with the argument that nobody from Fiesta en Tampa ever met with Batista. It's true that a few leaders of the Círculo Cubano had met with Batista, and here I think he's probably referring to the 1956 visit, but Favelo says this was back when the accuser, Juan Perez himself, sympathized with Batista. So Perez doesn't really have any room to talk, you know. The charges now having been thoroughly refuted, Favelo declares, "You could never say better than now, le partimos la psiquiatría, which I guess is like, you know, we beat the crap out of them or something. I don't know, out of him. Favelo gets Frankie to disavow Perez, and it's on the left-hand side of the slide. And maybe what's my favorite part of this newsletter, Favelo publishes pictures that include Perez's face on them, kind of with like circles around them or arrows pointing him out, you know, to sort of shame him. Okay, so the beauty queen. So they're on their official trip, as is their wont, this time in Cuba. And, you know, they almost find themselves mired in a conflict over the revolution, though of course they do emerge from the other side of this, and their names are all cleared with Frankie and the revolutionary Cuban government, which thus frees them to enjoy some normatively feminine adventures. So in Favelo's telling, you know, they leave some romances behind. They also go on a TV show. Here, I think they're dressed as beauty queens. I think they look kind of like brides. They get makeup as take-home gifts from this TV show. I think they might go lots of places on this trip dressed as beauty queens, because in the left-hand side of this, you can see this woman is wearing a sash that says the Loyal Knights of America. And I think this is just like when they're out and about, right? I think they must carry these costumes with them. So there's nothing in this 30-page newsletter to suggest that Favelo cares about politics in the slightest. If anything, his objection seems to be that they're not partisan at all. So again, we have this placid image that things are basically okay, and yet this is a trip in 1959 to Cuba, and there's no mention of anything that happens politically other than, you know, these accusations that Favelo wants to refute. So this trip they're just there for the spectacle. You know, they're not trying to participate in the narrative. But of course, the specter of revolution does loom large, because after all, the front page of the newsletter declares victory against the accusations that Favelo had supported Batista. And so the final episode I'm going to talk about is a Cuban-American beauty queen from New York named Nilda Nunez, who was crowned in July 1960 by the newspaper La Prensa. And apparently she went to Puerto Rico in her capacity as a queen, though when she arrived, she declared herself pro-Castro, renounced her crown on the grounds that La Prensa, the newspaper that whom she represented as a beauty queen, was anti-Castro, right? So she renounced them because they were anti-Castro. And in fact, she even credits the July 26th movement with having won her the crown in the first place. I guess they must have voted for her or something. Incidentally, I found some Puerto Rican bloggers on the internet called Puerto Rico en Breve, who say they FOIA'd the FBI, and here they've reproduced an FBI file that put her at a meeting of Puerto Rican independentistas at the time of her trip. So I'm still trying to find out more about her, but this event scandalized some people in the New York Caribbean community, and it seems to be because she, who was precisely meant to perform this stabilizing leveling function, erupted into the narrative of history. So yeah, that's it.